And then another one, which has now become kind of this weird thing that I'm almost known for now, is this whole, I sure thought it was a good argument that the apostles wouldn't have died for this.
Yes.
Because they knew it was, they personally were the guarantors to know it was true. They were eyewitnesses.
Yes.
And then that was just a huge one for me.
Yeah.
In investigating. Okay, first of all, you're saying that because they were eyewitnesses and they were martyred, they are guarantors. Okay. Did they die? Like, we'll walk backwards. Do we know that they were martyrs? No.
Yeah.
Like, we sure don't. And I've been criticized of late of de-emphasizing Sean McDowell's case. So let me give him the strong version.
Sure.
He thinks there's 6 that he categorizes more probable than not.
Yeah.
And even some of those aren't disciples. Some of those aren't the 12, but he says there's 6. But fine. Okay. There's 6. I don't happen to agree that there's a great historical case for those, but even so, then it's not like, well, it's not all of them.
Yeah. Let's
and
just
then,
for the audience real quick, let's
Sure.
just define what the argument is. So the argument is, and you and I are both very familiar with this argument. The argument is that, well, maybe I'll let you define the argument. Would you mind doing that?
Sure.
Yeah.
The argument that I would have used to make is that even though we have people who might fly a plane into a building on 9/11, those people are dying for what they believe. However, the earliest apostles died terrible deaths for what they witnessed personally firsthand. So because they witnessed it and could have then recanted and got out of their death, but didn't, chose to die instead, we can be very confident that they were telling us the truth.
Right. That they were sincere.
Would you agree
in their
that
belief. Yeah.
That's roughly the argument?
Yeah, I think that it's basically that there are people that believe they saw the resurrected Jesus separately from whether they did or not.
Correct.
They believed that they did, such that they were sincere in their belief, as evidenced by their willingness to die for that belief. Is more or less the argument that I've heard. Yeah. And I, like you, for a while I was like, well, that's compelling, because in my head, what's not said in that argument but implied is hundreds of people saw Jesus resurrected.
Right?
And they were all, like, what your brain imagines is hundreds of people saw the resurrected Jesus, and then not a gun because they didn't have guns, but I don't know, like a sword was put to their throat and they said, do you believe in Jesus? And, and they said, yes, I believe in Jesus. I saw him resurrected. Martyred. Like, that's what I imagined in my head. So I think we've established what the argument is. I always, because I think what happens in people's brains, people's minds, when they hear that argument is they fill in the blanks with all this really compelling stuff, right? Yep. Like, oh, all these people were martyred. Yeah, of course they wouldn't have, if they knew it was a lie, they would have just said, I'm just kidding, I'm not serious. Yep. But, it does make sense that their willingness to die would be an indicator that they're sincere. But when you actually look at, well, how many people were actually killed for sure? Do we know that they were given the opportunity to recant? We also know that Rome occupied Israel and Judea. So it's like there's a lot of political stuff going on. And of course, Rome had political motivations for killing people that they saw as a threat.
Well, or Nero, for example, in 64 AD, who literally was just looking for he set the city, if we believe Tacitus, that he set his own city on fire
and blamed the
Christians.
Christians.
Needed to blame somebody and say, oh, well, I'll blame those people. Well, those people weren't they were killed because they were Christians, but Nero didn't care what they believed. He didn't have some nuance of theology that was like the difference here. And theoretically, that's where both Paul and Peter were killed. Yeah, was under Nero's, persecution. So, like, in my head, it was like, oh, can I really count that as a martyrdom when it was like some guy with a political vendetta?
Yeah. And when you whittle it down, I mean, like I interrupted you when you were getting to this point. There's actually only a very small handful of people that we even have partial evidence of anything resembling martyrdom.
Right. And so we'll go with Sean's big number of 6.
Yeah. Yeah, and 6 includes, I mean, 6 includes Paul. And
Right.
Paul's, I think, one of the ones that's better established, right?
Paul is the most well attested.
Yeah.
He's the only one who we have firsthand saying, I saw risen Jesus.
Right.
But yet he saw, depending on how you deal with theology, either Jesus came back a second time to see him.
I was going to bring that up. So that's,
or he saw some other form that the others didn't see.
yeah, because Paul's experience was much later than all the others.
Correct. Years later, after the ascension.
Yeah, that was the other thing. Yeah. I've brought that up to an apologist friend before. Like, hey, under the category of things I didn't realize when I was a believer,
right.
Paul's experience was like way later, after the ascension, after he apparently rose into heaven, even though we know that like heaven isn't like actually physically up. So that's a whole other thing. But like, what did, you know, if Paul feels like he experienced the resurrected Jesus and the ascension was before that, did Jesus like come back down? And where was Jesus in the interim? And was he like in orbit? And my apologist friend was like, oh no, Jesus was in heaven. And I was like, so he was reincarnated. He was like incarnated again? Cause that's like,
did they keep the body around on storage?
Yeah. It's like, it's one of those questions that you just, if you're a believer, you don't think about it because it doesn't seem important. Right. But as soon as you start asking questions, it's like things get weird fast.
And I don't care a lot about Bible contradictions. I don't think that's as good an argument as many secular people think it is. But the fact is, when every time Paul's vision is described, it's different. So one time they can hear him but not see him.
Yeah.
And one time they can see him but not hear him.
Yeah.
And then others, it's just this big light that blinded him. I'm like, man, these sure sound like visions.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
So this martyrdom or argument, that's become a thing that like people have associated with you on some level now.
I think so. Yeah. I think I'm not aware of other people on the YouTube platform who were like deep diving into that particular argument. And I spent a bunch of time looking at each of the 12.
Yeah.
Like, what do people think Bartholomew did, and what do people think like the side ones, right? Because what frustrates me, and you alluded to it, was that you fill in the blanks, and so they deliberately use the word apostle,
right? Which can be misleading. Because I've asked apologists, what does the word apostle mean to you? And the answer I typically get is, well, it's not always the same, but the one that seems the most consistent is people who had experiences with the resurrected Jesus. Is that your understanding of the word, or?
Well, that's the earliest use of it.
Oh, okay.
But by the time the church fathers were using it, so and even partway through, I think it's in chapter. There's a mark, and I'm going to get this wrong, so apologize that I'm live. But somewhere around chapter 12, they start using it to mean people who were sent out.
Okay, yeah.
So it shifted in meaning from the closest group. So including like when they replaced, when Matthias stepped in for Judas, for example, in chapter 4, they're still using apostle, meaning a witness. But at some point, the church started using it just to mean people who are sent.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you are willing to conflate those things, so when you quote Clement or Polycarp or some of these early church fathers, when they say apostles, they are using it in that people who are sent sense.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah, that does make sense. So yeah, so do you feel like the usage of the term apostle is helpfully vague for? I do
believe it is.
Yeah.
It's one of those, nice conflations, which happens a lot in the arguments for God. It seems like sometimes words are used in multiple ways within the same argument.
Yeah.
If you're not watching for it, problem. So that's why I specifically when I talk to anyone about it, let's talk about the names of the people. Like, can you give me the names of the people you're talking about? Mm-hmm. Because yes, this general, and because they like to include the 500, right? So famously in 1 Corinthians 15 at the start, that there's this story that 500 people saw Jesus, but we don't know anything more, we don't even know where this was or any of this. But if you're willing to add that 500 into your count in your head, if you just accept the story at its word, well, yeah, this is a lot of people who saw Jesus who were dying, but we don't know that the story is accurate. We don't know what their names are. We don't know what they were out preaching. We don't know how they died. So
yeah,
what do we know?
I've
Nothing.
heard the argument with regards to the 500. I've heard the argument that it was something that people could go and verify at the time. Go and talk to those 500 people. That was the context of the verse. Like, go and talk to them, because it says some of them are asleep and some of them are. It basically infers some of them are still living. You could go talk to them and but you're right. That 500, that reference to 500 only appears in one place. It's not corroborated anywhere else, inside or outside of the Bible.
Correct.
And there's no names given.